Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Today we're going to be talking about American history, but not generally in the way most people think, where it's just lauded with facts and figures, but actually the real fabric of what American history is. We're going to be talking about a fictional newspaper today known as the Washington Sentinel, which started its first printing just after the end of the Civil War and all the way to the end of the 20th century. The book is titled The Final Edition. Joining us here on the program today is Washington Post reporter Lawrence Mayer, and I'd like to welcome him to the program as we talk about The Final Edition. Lawrence Mayer, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Started this big, wonderful book, got a long way to go, but I'll tell you, it's extremely compelling what you have in here, and it really started having me toss around a lot of questions. As you begin to think about what newspapers were like, especially right around, the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s here, and you kind of think, is journalism kind of dead when you kind of juxtapose it against the position of newspapers back in the day?
No, I don't think it's dead at all. We see signs of life all the time and all around us. I live in Washington, and I used to work for the Washington Post, and every time people think that the Post is sort of going to sleep, they knock you over the head with another big story. The most recent one was a series of articles about the intelligence establishment that has been built up since 9/11, and I think it was an important contribution to our public dialogue about how to keep America safe.
It really wasn't so much that I meant journalism itself is dead, but actually the, producing of it, because we see and listen to so much sensationalism, so much half news, whereas in the day they really reported what had happened, so to speak.
Well, yes and no. There's still a lot of serious journalism going on. There is a lot of opinionating going on out there with people just sounding off. There's a lot of manufacturing of information that isn't true. But even so, there's still, I think, a healthy core of good, solid reporting going on. Newspapers obviously are going through a difficult time, and when we come out of this, there probably will be fewer newspapers, but nonetheless, I still think that news gathering and straight news reporting is alive and maybe suffering at the moment, but I think it'll come back.
Well, as they say, good information always finds a way to the surface, doesn't it?
It does, and I think that one way or another, there's a great news hunger, continuing news hunger, people who want to know what actually happened and not what people think about what happened.
Mm-hmm. Now, as you put this novel together, you were saying in your book that it was a project that you had thought of, but it took you about 10 years to get started with. Why a fictional story about a newspaper with so much factual information about American history?
Well, I thought that in order to, I had a couple of things in mind when I started out writing the final edition. One, I wanted to tell a good story. I wanted to make the newspaper interesting. I wanted to take people behind the scenes and show them how news judgments are made, how stories are selected, what the kind of the politics of the institution are, and to do that with a real newspaper, there are all kinds of constraints and restraints on it. And this way, I could capture the flavor and make it true to the kind of the reality without having to worry about actual facts, which I don't mean to diminish the importance of facts, but in this particular instance, fiction's a lot easier to kind of present the story and the narrative that I wanted to present. Frankly, since I'm going back 100, I'm covering 125 years of American history. It was hard enough doing the research on the history without having to do the research of the personalities of an actual newspaper.
Yeah, that must have been something to put together for you.
I spent 5 years in the actual research and writing of the final edition, and I think that people who read it, older people who read it, will be reminded of things that they may not have, that they may have forgotten, or that they might not have known. And for younger readers, I think that history will come alive for them in the book.
Now, what's really fun is when you draw back to the very first character that this book starts off with. The building of the Washington Sentinel was a young, ambitious boy who walks in to get himself a job, and he's pretty much doing all the menial tasks, but then he finally gets his true break, unfortunately, when he happens to be at the theater the night that Abraham Lincoln becomes assassinated. Tell us about that.
Well, the Brewster Hopkins is a young merchant seaman who spent 10 years at sea. He comes from New England, and he travels the world for 10 years, and then he comes to Washington, and he gets there just as the Civil War is drawing to a close, and he's kind of fascinated by it, and he talks his way into the Washington Sentinel, pushing a broom. And one day, the editor of the paper needs somebody to go cover a speech that Abraham Lincoln is going to make from the White House, which he actually did. He spoke out a window to a crowd that had assembled below, and editor has nobody else to send, and he can't go because he's got to finish putting out the paper and getting it ready. So Hopkins goes to cover the speech and does a credible job. And then he gets promoted, and he gets a little bit of a raise in salary. And to celebrate, he decides he's going to go to Ford's Theater to see Our American Cousin. And just coincidentally, it turns out that Abraham Lincoln is going to be in the theater that night. And when Hopkins learns this, he positions himself he only could get a standing room ticket, so he's able to stand over on the side of the theater, which is pretty small, and he has a direct view of the presidential box. And Lincoln comes in, and the play goes on, and Hopkins is paying attention to the play, but also to the presidential box, and then he sees a flash and a struggle in the box, and then a man who he had seen before jumps to the stage and says something, and then goes limping off, and then somebody says the president's been shot. And as it turns out, Brewster Hopkins is the only newsman in the theater at the time of the assassination, and so he has the only eyewitness account of what happened. His career is sort of launched at that moment.
Fascinating stuff. Now, he gets the opportunity now to meet with someone. It was interesting what you talk about here when it comes to Miss Baker that he meets. That'd be, Mary Hopkins. And that is that she had wealth, but it was one of those things where on the East Coast you had to be bred into it if you wanted really opportunity, but in Washington it just mattered whether you had the money or not. And so it kind of shows how things were evolving when it comes to Washington.
Well, that's still true. I think we're talking about Elizabeth Warren, who he meets and subsequently marries. Her father made a fortune in gold mining. Her family initially was very poor, and in fact her mother dies because her mother was working so hard that she lost her health. But her father comes back. He's made a fortune in mining, and then he buys railroad stock and makes another fortune. but he's kind of a working class. But what has historically been true in Washington and is still true is that anyone with money can get into Washington society. They're not. This is. They're really kind of two levels of Washington society, but for all intents and purposes, there used to be a group called the Cliff Dwellers, and they were wealthy, but they had been here forever. And then there's another group of kind of nouveau riche people who are hanging around the fringes of politics, and that's the more active Washington society, and it's still true to this day. And the Warrens are involved in that kind of nouveau riche society. Elizabeth and Brewster meet each other, they fall in love, and they get married, and it's because of her fortune, ultimately, that he's able to purchase the Washington Sentinel.
Now, newspapers especially had a very important influence when it came to power, especially with politicians. And you write about a lot of the different U.S. presidents during the day. How common was it for newspaper journalists to become familiar with heads of state and the like?
It was familiar. It was not unusual then, and it continues not to be unusual now, although, of course, access to the president is much more difficult. But back in the 19th century, it wasn't a big deal to be able to walk into the White House, and if you were somebody in some kind of an official capacity or a member of the Fourth Estate, a newspaper person, you could pretty easily talk your way into the Oval Office to talk to the president. Today, of course, it's more difficult, but when Lyndon Johnson was president, he thought nothing of picking up the phone and calling reporters to complain about stories or to compliment them and try to charm them into writing things. Different presidents, of course, have different relationships. More recently, presidents have been a little reluctant to establish relationships with reporters, and reporters, there's a different kind of an ethic now and a different culture in Washington than there might have been 40 or 50 years ago, so it's more difficult to have that kind of one-on-one relationship. But President Obama, although he doesn't seem to like to give press conferences, has made himself available fairly frequently to one-on-one interviews on the record with newspaper reporters and with electronic media.
Now, was Washington Sentinel in any way sort of the image of the Washington Post?
Actually, people ask me this all the time, and in point of fact, the paper that I had in mind and the paper that the Washington Sentinel is really modeled after is the Washington Star, which for almost a century, and maybe for a century, was the preeminent newspaper in Washington. It was an afternoon newspaper, as the Washington Sentinel is in the final edition, and it was owned by one family for most of the period from the Civil War until about 1970.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. Now, I know that as I was reading that Mary Hopkins seemed to have sort of, an image of Katharine Graham.
Katharine Graham was not the first woman to be the publisher of a newspaper in Washington.
Mm-hmm.
There was a woman named Cissy Patterson, who was a cousin of Robert R. McCormick, who was the publisher of the Chicago Tribune, and she was the editor of the I think the Washington Times Mirror. I'm a little fuzzy on exactly which newspaper was hers, which was ultimately bought by the Washington Post. But she was a strong woman. Katharine Graham, of course, is a very strong woman. But unlike Katharine Graham and Sissy Patterson, Mary Hopkins, although she's intelligent and totally competent, is not allowed to become the publisher of the Washington Sentinel in the book. Although she's always there on the fringe, and by the time her moment comes, she thinks that she's really too old to run the paper day to day, and so she chooses her her nephew-in-law, Charles Baker, to run the paper, but he pays close attention to what Mary Hopkins wants.
Mm-hmm. Now, you have so much here, and it must have taken quite a while to put it together. How did you decide to lay out what you did as far as this novel is concerned when it comes to historical facts?
Well, of course, there are a couple of themes that I wanted to develop in the book. Clearly, I couldn't talk about 125 years of history. There does have to be a selection process. But for me, the most important stories were the America coming to terms with the problem of race in America and the place of African Americans in American society. It comes up over and over again throughout that 125-year period until some positive steps are taken toward resolving the question and truly integrating African Americans into American society. So that was one thing that I wanted to pay attention to. Another was the emergence of the United States as a world power, and it's playing a role in world affairs, kind of reluctantly entering World War I, and in some respects not at all wanting to become involved in World War II, but then, of course, Pearl Harbor kind of forces the issue. And there I wanted to show that Franklin Roosevelt, although he believed that the United States inevitably had to be involved in the Second World War, couldn't say so publicly. He had to play a little game. But at the same time that he's doing that, he's having a conversation with Charles Baker, who's then the editor and publisher of the Washington Sentinel, encouraging Charles Baker to be pushing the United States to get involved in Europe. And he says, Charlie, I can't say it publicly, but I want you to keep pushing and keep trying to promote a policy of our involvement, which in fact was what Roosevelt was doing. So there is historical support for the conversation that I have in the book between Roosevelt and Charles Baker.
Mm-hmm. Now, newspapers had tremendous power, especially in this particular family, where in just one generation they went to seeming obscurity into riches. And talk about how newspapers were so powerful, because they were sort of, in essence, a way to keep society free, sort of like a checks and balances, if you will.
Well, at that time, and from 1865 to 1900, and then really until the 1920s, newspapers were the only source of information for people. Radio had not come along, and television didn't really get started until about 1948. So newspapers were a source of information, the only source of information, a place where opinions could be expressed, and newspaper publishers, because of newspapers were so successful in so many cities, newspaper publishers became quite wealthy. Mm-hmm. And so in addition to having a kind of a professional position, they also had a prominent social position in communities. And in many communities, I worked in Louisville for the Louisville Times, and in that particular instance, the Bingham family was arguably the most powerful family in Louisville and in Kentucky, and it was by virtue of their ownership of the Courier-Journal, the Louisville Times, later a television station. So they, although their prominence and power didn't always translate into being able to project it into the political arena, they certainly had a lot of influence.
Mm-hmm. Now, what did you, like I said, there's so much in here that we could talk about, but of the things that you put into this novel, the final edition, what were some of the most intriguing things that came out for you that you probably didn't expect?
I'm not sure that there's anything in there that I didn't expect. But if I can kind of reinterpret your question, I wanted to have a character who is underestimated by everybody and dismissed as either being barely competent or incompetent and really not capable of running the newspaper, and then having this character surprise everybody by turning out to be the most competent, the bravest, and best editor and publisher in the history of the Washington Sentinel. And I did, in fact, I used a favorite quote of mine from Isaiah in the front of the book. Stone that the builders has rejected has become the chief cornerstone. That, in essence, is Cubby Baker, who is the 48 and remains a publisher for about.
Mm-hmm. Now, you did end the novel right around the 1990s. Was there a reason you couldn't bring it up to close to today?
I felt that the closer we got to the current time, the more difficult it was to book. And in a way, I thought it was a little awkward to end the book before around 9/11 in 2001, and so I thought it was just better. The paper is struggling for so many years that to have it limping along wasn't credible, and those two reasons.
Well, for those who are interested, the book is the final edition. It's certainly a wonderful novel when it comes to U.S. history and how paper and journalism works. And our guest today, Lawrence Mary. Is there a website people can find out more?
There is a website. I have a website, Final Edition the Book. It's all one word, .com. The book is available from Amazon, and it's also available for people who have a They can purchase it either way. Not sold in bookstores. Go to the website. There's a direct link to Amazon, or they can simply go right to Amazon. But final edition, thebook.com. Summary of the book. It has an excerpt from the book. It tells a little bit about my career at the Washington Post, and way people can find out more about the book if they're interested.
Well, Lawrence Mayer, thank you so much for taking us through American history this way. It's very enjoyable.
Well, I appreciate your having me on. Thanks very much for giving.
Thank you. Go ahead and give out your website again one more time.
Final edition, the book.
Lawrence Mayer, thanks for being on the Beyond 50 radio program. We want to thank you, the listeners, for tuning in. You've been listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. Be sure to visit us at our website at beyond50radio.com. We'll also post the final edition, thebook.com, for you so you can find out more about that. Thank you again for tuning in. I'm Daniel Davis, and remember, live your day past halfway.